So the starting point for this talk is a question that a friend of mine once asked me, an opera friend. He said to me, "We know who the opera fan is. Who is the art song fan?" A problematic question. What he, I think, meant is there are certain famous, imaginable descriptors that come to mind when one thinks of an opera fan. Some of those, many of those, are going to come up in the Queen's throat. And so my friend's question was, does anything comparable exist for people like me who are obsessed, really obsessed with German art song? Right. So I thought about it, and I had sort of two answers, two related answers. One is a kind of generic, as in genre-related answer. The other is a kind of queer identifying answer, and really the two are one. Now, who is the lover of opera? One of the very famous people who is the lover of opera is the gay white cis man. That is a person who is the lover of opera. This is, of course, a stereotype. This part of what this book is a kind of wrestle with the stereotypes about gay men and opera, and which are true, mostly talks about things that are true and in his own experience. But in any case, the problems of it all are front and center. So we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between art song form and opera form through this kind of queer ethnographic lens. Although I will be making quite a lot of references to personal anecdote, I hope all of these will be heuristics that are going to help us examine the forms in question rather than just voyeuristics, if you will. So I'm going to start out by saying, well, one thing is that whenever I'm in a classical music space, I tend to note if anybody in the room looks like me, or at least doesn't look like the kind of uniform sea of white, cis faces, usually above a certain age, which, no disrespect, the lack of disrespect, I hope will come clear as we talk. But always, for me, there is this, when I'm in a classical space, I have this thought of, I know how I got here. How did you get here? I don't know if the meaning of that question is clear, but the point is that there isn't a visibility for bodies like mine in classical music. Certainly not the way there is for these kinds of bodies. And it's not always a matter of what's good or bad. One can have a terrifying degree of overexposure just as much as a stifling degree of underexposure. So the point is that underlying all of this is me looking for my people, me looking for my audience, and that's also part of why I'm so glad to see all of you here. I was always a genderqueer kid. I always knew, not gay, genderqueer. This. And early on, I had a very clear sense of the meaning, the sexual politics, the politics in general, of the music that my peers listened to, of pop music, which was a lot of boy bands at the time. And it's not like I hated that, it's just, I knew that it wasn't for me. I was proscribed existentially from that kind of musical discourse, not just because, well, I could go on, but I won't. The point is, I latched on very early to the classical guitar as my form of adolescent rebellion. It was something no one around me knew anything about. It's a margin within a margin. The only reason I picked this thing up is because it happened to be two-hand, because a very prescient German great aunt sent me one, and thus changed my life and made things come full circle in a German sense, as we will see. So I listened to nothing but classical guitar music through much of my adolescence. I loved it, and I still do, and I still play. I love the classical guitar, but it wasn't enough. Something was missing. I wanted more, and I knew this. Fast forward to the 1990s. I'm somewhere in my adolescence, and we're on a family trip to Barnes & Noble. Do you remember those listening booth machine things they used to have, Barnes & Noble? You put on the headphones and you can see which of their CDs you might want to purchase and take home with you, because that's how music was at that time. Well, I'm going through one of those in the privacy of that little booth. And I put on an opera collection. And I hear this. All right, sorry if I'm good. But imagine me with the headphones, like, freaking out, brain exploding, right? Oh my God, what is this? What's happening? What is this? What was happening, of course, was I heard the sound of a powerful, musical, male body, and I wanted that. That's why this is sort of a non-binary story. I caught just the name F. Corelli, and I caught the name of the aria. It means something about women, I think. Great. So, and that's all I knew. Now, you would think that I would have rattled on to my parents because I'd had this exciting experience. I did not. Slides here. Here's Kustenbaum explaining exactly the feeling that kept me from saying anything for years. Maybe until now. I don't know if I've ever told this story. I started listening to opera, this is Kustenbaum from this book, because the convulsive vibrato of a trained voice embarrassed me. It filled me with an uncanny discomfort that I now call pleasure. But in those days I didn't call it pleasure. I didn't try to imitate Carmen, Don Jose, or Escamillo. I didn't try to fill the room with magnificent sound. Instead, I wallowed in embarrassment. I cringed, and I silently vowed, in shame will I find paradise. That's exactly how it felt. Now, what exactly was the source of this embarrassment? I think there were sort of two things. One is that I already knew at that age that this type of romanticism is kind of excessive and kind of overdramatic, and one is taking a certain aesthetic risk in liking it for that very reason. You're not supposed to like opera because it's just way too much. The other thing, though, is that I knew the reason I was into this voice was because I wanted it. And that is why I did not say anything. And even when I would go to the opera later, eventually, I never mentioned to anybody the special way that I felt about tenors. So that is how I first came to opera. Here's another remark from Kustenbaum that relates. I'm an opera fan because I crave the soprano voice, gendered as appropriate for this particular white male opera persona. The listener's inner body is illuminated, opened up. A singer exposes the listener's interior. Her voice enters me. The singer, through osmosis, passes through the self's porous membrane and discredits the fiction that bodies are separate, boundaried packages. The singer destroys the division between her body and our own. For her sound enters our system. I am sitting in the Met at Leontine Price's recital in 1985, and Price's vibrations are inside my body, dressing it up with the accoutrement of interiority. Am I listening to Leontine Price, or am I incorporating her, swallowing her, memorizing her? And I begin to believe, sheer illusion, that she spins out myself, not hers. Mm-hmm. So this is what I've called a kind of this fantasy of ventriloquism. It still happens to me when I have to, sitting in a concert hall, and I have to stop myself from mimicking with my mouth the sounds of the vowels and the consonants. There is this desire to be able to produce those sounds. these are some quotes about why. I wish there were time to linger them over a little bit more. We can come back to them. So here's now something else that Kostenbaum says. And I'm glad, by the way, that he uses the word queer alongside the word gay or homosexual. He's essentially presciently sort of made room for me in this account, so I appreciate that. Kostenbaum writes, I hypothesize that opera's hypnotic hold over modern gay audiences has some connection to the erotic interlocking of words and music, two contrary symbolic systems with gendered attributes. I'm an opera fan because I crave the soprano voice, we saw this bit, but the other reason, the genre reason, I could also trace my queer fandom to the nature of opera, which places words and music together and apart, always both at once. Opera's task is to recombine words and music, the severed halves of a body once single and whole. Skipping a little bit. Living in opera's shadow, I sometimes experience a desire for wholeness and a simultaneous desire for fragmentation, a contrary back and forth movement. That's a lovely statement of what's dialectical about all of this, but that's a whole nother talk. So if I came to opera for the tenors, I stayed for this marriage, as some theorists put it, of music and text. That marriage is a really interesting, problematic metaphor for all of this, especially in this context, and that it actually comes up in here. So what happens next, and here I'm going to get to art song. This is actually sort of, this very principle, this erotic interlocking of words and music, this is actually what takes me through and alongside opera into German art song, where a deep well into which I rather fell at this particular point in time a couple of years after my undergraduate work. I had been an English major, I graduated, I suddenly had time to look into music, I had heard of the art song and Schubert, but I never really investigated because it seemed like a sort of very deep, self-enclosed well, and I always walked by the well. Then, one day, I fell in the well, and I'm still in it. Now, what is so special about art song that I have never sought to extricate myself from the deep well to which I have compared it? Well, in short, it's the fact that the poem comes first. No, we're not there yet. The poem comes first. That means that when the composer is setting the poem to music, they have a different, maybe not harder, but a different task than the composer setting opera libretto to music. And it is not because a poem is good and a libretto is bad writing. Sometimes not. Some great Schubert songs are made from some lousy poems that make great song texts. And every once in a while you get a libretto that's actually a very smart text. I happen to like the De Ponte libretti. So it's not about good or bad, it's about priority. Libretto it may not be written after the music, but is secondary to it, in some sense. Not so with a poem that becomes an art song. So what really dawned on me it was a quite sudden moment when I found some very silly sentence on the internet, something to the effect of course, in order to best enjoy German art songs, it's best to know what the words mean. Like, couldn't be more obvious sentence. And it, again, brain exploding. I felt like a cartoon piano fell on my head and stars were whizzing around or something like that. Everything changed in that moment. And I eventually went to grad school to write a dissertation precisely on this question of what is it that happens with words and music? And is there a way that I can explain, argumentatively if one will, what I find so queer in my sense about the way words and music come together in German art song, even more than in opera, and I still love opera, by the way, it's not that. So, well, one consequence of this is that much as I had taken to Italian dramatic tenors in my adolescence, so I latched on to the lyric lead baritone, particularly one Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, who there was something about, again, with this sort of physical person. I attached myself rather to the person of this singer, Fischer-Dieskau, who was one of the main lead interpreters of the 20th century, though he also is an opera performer. Controversially or not, a whole other question. Could be talking about that right now for this panel. Anyway, though, Fischer-Dieskau sort of, became like Corelli, except far even more so. Corelli didn't stand out individually to me, but this man did, and I think it's partly because when I looked at him, I felt like I was seeing something I could grow up into, a sort of appropriate, older, future thing that could be like me, because he has that sort of lyric intensity, because he has that scholarly quality, even if he denied it. I think Hindemith had said to him, "You're not a singer, you're a bard." Right? Love that. And then, in 2012, suddenly he didn't exist anymore, and I experienced a grief over celebrity death like I did not even think possible. So this is kind of a way of, I'm trying to tease out the connection between the queer elements that I'm seeing in the art song that have to do with the words and music, and those that have to do with this sort of person, the body of the singer and of the audience. It's really hard to define that connection. This is a giant problem for me academically. It has been a very serious problem for publishing. Seems that, at least to a degree, Kostenbaum also ran into this. Here is a Kirkus review of The Queen's Throat. What this person is basically saying is that he fails to make clear exactly what, if anything, differentiates gay and straight audiences' respective responses to opera, and fails to demonstrate that gay audiences are by nature predisposed to operatic conventions. Being unable to produce a definition that is going to satisfy reviewers or interlocutors who are coming at it from a perspective that's very sort of literal and binary and kind of reductive and two-dimensional like this, it's a giant problem. In wrapping up, I will say that I'm still trying to figure out how to make this argument so that I can publish things about it. I'd really like to. Yeah, right? Here's something I found recently that's actually helped me close the gap in my own understanding a little bit. Eros the Bittersweet, this is by Anne Carson. Almost reminds me in certain funny ways of Kostenbaum's book, but that is not the point. The point is that Anne Carson says things like, most people find something disturbingly lucid and true in Aristophanes' image of lovers as people cut in half. All desire is for a part of oneself gone missing, or so it feels to the person in love. When I desire you, part of me is gone. That is that same thing that I felt growing up, that made me respond to the Franco Corelli that way, that made me respond later to the German art song that way. Certainly that has made me respond to romantic love and encounters in my life this way. Now that is not a definition. Here is where Carson is helping me a little bit toward a definition. No. Love, she's saying, changes the lover's perception, because when you fall in love, suddenly you look back and you see a hole in yourself. Where does that hole come from? It comes from desire for an object that he never knew he lacked, and which now seems like an integral missing part of himself. Here's my theory. Part of what it means to have a queer response is to know that something is missing. To have precognition of the missingness of something. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a particular kind of experience or a particular kind of body. But it does mean retaining a knowledge of certain kinds of potential for love, for relations, for existing, for embodiment, that many forget on purpose or because we're told to forget. Queers can't forget. We remember. We may not dare to believe what we know, but we can't forget. And that, to me, is part of what I think makes art song such a good metaphor for me for queerness. This whole time I was out here trying to say, oi, the German art song is queer in my own fashion, but how do I say how? Really, I think in some ways I sort of had it backwards. It's more that queerness is a bit like the art song. I will wrap up right here. Had there been more time, I was going to play a very short bit of Lieder wherein words from Goethe that I think resound with what I was trying to say about queerness exist. Selig wer sich vor der Welt ohne Hass verschließt, einen Freund am Busen hält und mit dem genießt, was von Menschen nicht gewusst oder nicht bedacht, durch das Labyrinth der Brust wandert in der Nacht. So I'll stop there. Thanks, everyone.